The Toronto moving around May. Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Exactly. With it, yeah. They know Mark Margulies and the Pierre Lelec.
I was just good. I was just with Daniel 2 days ago.
Daniel Margulies?
Yeah, because I went to Whistler to the functional connectivity symposium and he was there. Yeah, that's okay. No secret. Huh? Okay. We'll cut that from the recordings. Yeah. From where? If any of you can come and do the recording, then. Ready? Francisco, ready? Recording of, okay? All right. So thank you, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Pamela K. Douglas. She's a computational neuroscientist whose work lies at the intersection of cognitive neuroscience and artificial intelligence. She completed her PhD in neuroengineering at UCLA after studying biomedical engineering at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Pennsylvania. Currently, Dr. Douglas has a joint appointment as an assistant professor at UCLA and at the University of Central Florida, where she is part of the computer science department. For many years, Dr. Douglas has focused in applying machine learning methods to the dual purpose of prediction and neuroscientific knowledge gain. Current research interests includes explainable deep learning, brain computational models of attention, and latency mapping in the brain. Today, she's going to talk to us a little bit about the challenges and successes of explainable artificial intelligence in neuroimaging. Please help me welcome Dr. Douglas to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's very exciting to be here at the NIH in this beautiful place, in the largest collection of bricks, I think, in the world, in this building. So, yes, I'm going to talk about explainable AI for neuroimaging and some of my recent work on the challenges and future directions of where we should be moving in terms of understanding what's inside the black box of deep learning. But first, I'm going to give just a little bit of an intro to get a running start and contextualize where deep learning sort of falls in kind of the broader spectrum. So this is now a very classic paper that from 1973 that Russ Poldrack and others have brought up, and now it has resurfaced. So in 1973, Alan Newell was frustrated with the field of psychology and cognitive scientists because they kept testing one single hypothesis or one variable at a time, often answering binary questions. So this type of reductionism, he argued, led to paradigm-bound theories. So instead, the goal should be to try and bridge levels of abstraction and integrate knowledge into more of a unified model of human information processing that can perform tasks and, importantly, generalize to new ones. So many years later, of course, with the advent of fMRI, this same process of answering single questions one at a time began again. So these early brain mapping studies would localize specific tasks, usually using subtraction-based methods, asking one question at a time. So brain mapping is, of course, very useful because it reveals this global functional layout of the brain, and it's useful for constraining theory because, of course, information exchange is thought to occur over distance, number of connections, and, of course, signal latency. So in theory, closer regions may interact with higher bandwidth. But unfortunately, humans can engage a variety of different strategies or subfunctions when accomplishing a task. So this type of inference, that inferring a specific cognitive process is engaged based on an experimental manipulation, is of course referred to as reverse inference in this now very famous paper. So of course, brain maps at whatever scale in this sense do not reveal computational mechanisms. So instead, the focus should be towards moving into brain computational models, or models that use neurobiologically plausible components to model behavior, accomplish complex cognitive tasks, and use neural activity data to adjudicate between different competing models. So one way to think about this is that a brain computational model in that sense bridges all of the Mars 3 levels of analysis. In that sense, using neurobiologically plausible parts or the hardware to represent information and manipulate it using biologically plausible algorithms to then accomplish complex tasks. But today I'm going to be focusing on this level here, representation and algorithm, how inputs are represented and manipulated into outputs. So in the world of neuroimaging, the two most famous types of representational models are encoding and decoding models. So representational analyses ask not just mapping a specific task to a smooth area of the brain, but how do fine-grained activity patterns relate to specific cognitive processes. So with encoding models, we take aspects of the stimulus and we try to actually predict the patterns of brain activity measurements. Decoding models do the opposite. They start with the measurements and try to then predict usually aspects of the stimulus. So in this sense, because the information flow with encoding models is in the same direction as the brain, one can then interpret encoding models as a brain computational model. But unfortunately, decoding models are in the opposite direction unless they are used to predict aspects of the response. So I think that these terms, encoding and decoding, actually probably date back to the early work with autoencoders from 1987, Jan LeCun. So autoencoders are very interesting because you feed a model some sort of input, say an image, and the goal is then to represent that input and then be able to decode it. So one of the questions is, with autoencoders, why not just set up a model that directly copies the input? But usually one of the goals is to learn a representation that's then useful in future tasks. So typically, the representation needs to be useful across multiple tasks, which may be one of the reasons why humans are very good at learning from just a few examples, as opposed to deep learning models, which currently need many, many, many examples. So with decoding models, we're trying to ask, what can we learn about the outside world by observing patterns of activity? And they're inherently multivariate. They find patterns or voxels or features that collaboratively discriminate between different experimental conditions. They can be used to make predictions on unseen data, and in theory, they may be able to reveal information about the neural code that exists in sort of patchy functional segregation. One of the nice things about decoding models is that in contrast to the early subtraction-based mass univariate models, the brain mapping approaches, those approaches typically assume a form for the hemodynamic response function, or they estimate the HRF. But instead, decoding models are in that sense model-free. You don't have to use a specific double gamma hemodynamic response function. So here are just a few decoding examples that I've been involved with over the years. Predicting autism spectrum disorder with Jeff Rudy using functional connectivity measurements, predicting ADHD diagnoses, and now more recently replicating that diagnosis on another large data set, predicting religious belief or autobiographical belief with independent component features based on either fMRI or EEG data, predicting ADHD with functional modular organization, or recently there's this paper with Leo Moore, my postdoc, on predicting empathy from self-other resonance networks. So there's all different fun ways to apply decoding examples, and they've become a very popular tool in the neuroimaging community. So there are, of course, many, many types of classifiers, each with their own inductive bias, but by far the most common type of decoding in the field has been linear classifiers. But why? Linear classifiers are thought to be computationally efficient, easily interpretable, and can yield accuracies sometimes, it depends on the paper, that are similar to the more complex machine learning classifiers or deep learning models. And linear classifiers are thought to work at this level of explicit representations, meaning that they work at the level of readout. So just to explain what is meant by explicit representations, the concept of an automobile, say, is thought to be hopelessly entangled at the level of the retina, but through the processing of the brain, through the ventral stream, that representation becomes further and further separated until you reach this explicit representation, the level of readout. And it turns out that that is correct, at least according to this nice study by Hong, who showed that decoding with linear models works better at higher levels of processing compared to lower levels of processing. But unfortunately, even linear models are actually they require some care in the interpretation phase. So this is a very simple example. Let's suppose we have two voxels. The first voxel has some signal plus some sort of error or noise. And we have a second voxel, which is nearby, and it also contains just noise. But the two measurements are completely independent, and there's no covariance between the two measurements. So if we plot the measurements here, what we get, if we're trying to separate them, is the data here. Let's suppose there's two different means. You can project that data down onto the uninformative, noisy feature, x2, or you can project it here onto x1. So the nice thing in this example where the covariance is 0 is that the weights actually match perfectly, as you would expect, with the features. But what happens when the noise covaries across both voxels, you get this rotation of the data. And what happens is if you project the data now onto each domain, you can see that the W vector, which is the vector that assigns the weights to each feature, actually ends up assigning a stronger weight to the noise voxel than the informative voxel. So this is quite disappointing if you've been in the habit of interpreting your weights as directly meaning the importance of that specific feature or voxel in making a prediction. But as Stefan Halfa and Jessica Schroef and others have pointed out, there's this nice correction method where you simply take the inverse transpose, if in the case of a square matrix, and you can actually recover the activations. But unfortunately, different types of noise can actually corrupt that recovery process. So drift, motion, periodic noise can actually make it very difficult to recover the weights depending on the type of linear model that you're applying. So in this case, presenting weight maps as results can actually lead to this implied interpretation that the weights are actually meaningful in the same way that a brain map or a general linear model result might be. But this is, again, in the case where your features contain neutral information. But what if the features are independent? So I've done quite a bit of work with Ariana Anderson on using independent components as classifier dimensions. And it becomes a bit easier in the ICA case to make interpretations because the features are thought to be independent. But there is some residual covariance, just to be clear. So this is nice, but there is still, even in the case of ICA, some residual covariance. So unfortunately, one thing that's also quite common is using regularization or imposing sparsity on your linear models. But this is important here because if you have a redundant signal in two voxels, let's say this middle row here, you get the univariate contrast map, or the classic brain mapping approach, and it shows that both voxels are significant. But if you use, for example, the L1 lasso penalty, what the model will do is assign somewhat randomly the importance to just one of the voxels. So some of the time it will choose a particular voxel, and some of the time it will choose another voxel. And I don't mean to ruin all the fun and excitement and suspense of what happens later in my lecture, but suffice to say, this problem actually, I think, is still potentially an issue in the interpretation of deep learning neural networks. So in theory, when interpreting decoding models, comparing accuracy between different brain regions is definitely probably one of the safest ways to go. However, of course, there is this local hemodynamic response efficiency because the HRF varies across different regions. So some of the comparison of accuracy may just simply be due to sampling the HRF or which laminar layer that you're measuring in. So it turns out that encoding models also have problems even in the linear case when trying to interpret them. Because it turns out that with encoding models, there are multiple types of basis functions or features that can lead to the same ability to describe the variance of the data. So for example, in this particular model, sensory or motor movements by fingers or just simply random vectors could all describe the data in the sensory motor cortex equally as well. So the key here is to, of course, test multiple models. So from a systems ID point of view, this is kind of somewhat similar to a problem that's non-uniquely identifiable because multiple models or multiple solutions all perform equally well. So if you just test one model, you can end up with this single model fallacy. So interpreting the fact that a single model explains significant variance as evidence in favor of that model. So it's always important to test multiple models for both decoding and encoding studies. So an example of the single model fallacy, let's suppose, for example, that we had this hypothesis that the Simpsons predict everything. If we were to search the internet, we would find out that, as it turns out, the Simpsons do predict everything. They predicted, apparently, Trump's election, three-eyed fish appearing in Argentina, Toys R Us closing, and even different types of spread of different viruses. So, yeah. So what about deep learning models? Encoding and decoding representational models are mostly interpretable, but even require great care using the linear approach. But what if we expand to deep learning models? So just to get excited, there's a lot of hype around deep learning models for many years now. They can be used for all different types of deep reinforcement learning, to play Atari games, image-to-image translation. There's even generative models used in retail. So if you're trying to figure out which one's the real model versus the fake model, those are the fake ones. So, yeah. Thank you to Andrew Doyle for the fashion example. You can also use deep learning models to generate different types of art. So it's very exciting. But what about neuroimaging? Deep learning has also generated new discoveries in radiology. So my brother is a radiologist, and he told me that the general wisdom for a radiologist for many years was just to look at the borders of different tumors to determine and stage different types of brain tumors. But convolutional neural network predictions based on texture features from within the tumor volumes are diagnostic, as it turns out, of cerebral gliomas and survival prediction. So when I told my brother about this, he got excited. He said, I always knew that there was something inside the tumor, but I could never really detect it myself. So it turns out that these algorithms are operating, as it would appear, on something inside the tumor, and that's what actually leads to this strong ability to predict as well as stage different types of gliomas. So that's exciting. But before deep learning can really achieve widespread adoption, I think there's three things that it needs to achieve. It needs to be fair, of course, to avoid perpetuating demographic biases and inequalities in different before the technology is fully deployed. So this is a classic, even though it's fairly new, the deep learning world moves very quickly. So this was showing predictive inequality and detecting pedestrians of different skin tones using a recurrent neural network. It also needs to be reliable. So the model needs to be robust to different adversaries, noise, and perturbation. So turns out that small, sometimes very small perturbations can actually cause deep learning neural networks to fail. There's some famous work on people perturbing different stop signs and how that caused simulated self-driving cars to fail. And also they need to be interpretable. So transparency is very important for building trust with users and also identifying points of model failure. So how do we interpret deep learning models? Well, of course, we just add more algorithms. So how do you interpret an algorithm? You use an algorithm. So that's, you have to have at least one meme. So I had two. So there's a number of criterion that have been proposed for saliency methods in deep learning. So first of all, the methods need to be sensitive in the sense that they detect all of the input variables that are important or relevant for model predictions. They also should be input invariant, meaning that the saliency method should mirror the sensitivity of the model to the different input perturbations. And also, they should be specific. So they should be capable of filtering out distractor or different noise variables. So one of the simplest methods, one of the early methods for assigning relevance to deep learning neural networks was sensitivity. So how do small input perturbations alter the model performance? So for example, one could take some sort of block and drop out that part of the image and see what happened to the accuracy. Did the accuracy go up or down after we altered the input in some way? But unfortunately, as it turns out, a lot of the regularization methods used in deep learning do similar things. So there's this technique called drop block, where specifically dropping out blocks of the image actually boosts the accuracy. And it's possible in some examples where you drop out an otherwise informative feature, but you still get a boost in the accuracy because of the numerics of the deep learning problem. So many of the different regularization methods, such as dropout, SGD, label noise, drop path, drop block, shake, a lot of these add noise to actually, in some way, improve the accuracy of the model. So in that sense, the sensitivity method may not be straightforward to interpret. There's also attribution methods for relevance redistribution. So in this type of saliency method, the model is first trained using backpropagation and all of the classic ways to train your model. So you run the forward pass, then on the left out data exemplar of interest that you would like to interpret, and then you run this reverse relevance propagation. So one of the nice conservation properties that has been proposed is this idea of global conservation of relevance. So when you're back propagating the relevance through the model to try and determine which aspects of the input led to the output prediction, is to require each layer to the sum of all the relevances at each layer to be equivalent. So in each direction. So two methods that can be used in this way are layer-wise relevance propagation and deep Taylor decomposition, which are very closely related methods. These are typically implemented using the alpha or the positive evidence and the beta or the negative evidence rule. So these suggest that the relevance should be redistributed to lower layers in proportion to their excitatory and their inhibitory effect on particular neuronal activation. And if you set the root point to 0 and alpha equal to 1, then LRP can be viewed as a deep Taylor expansion through the layers. But as it turns out, many of the methods, there's a whole host of different saliency methods that have been proposed. A whole variety of them fail this test of input invariance. So this is from Kindermans, where he showed that if you just take the MNIST data set, which is one of the classic handwriting data sets of different numbers, and you shift that input by just adding or subtracting a bias term, then what you get actually is that the two networks will actually have the exact same weights, they will have the exact same predictions, and yet the interpretation is different for almost all of the different techniques tested, at least in this paper, except for pattern attribution. So essentially, the majority of the methods for detecting saliency fail this input invariance test. So our goal recently was to test a variety of relevance methods on neuroimaging data. So the data that we used was classic ADHD data. So we used the data from the ADHD 200 study in addition to the UCLA TREC or SIDAR data set. So this allowed us to test out these different saliency methods. So just to dial back just a little bit, a number of years ago, there was this ADHD 200 competition where the goal was to train your model on 776 labeled brains and then make predictions on 200 unlabeled brains from 7 different sites. So I participated in this competition, and we had something like 100,000 different features from cortical and subcortical volumes and morphology, resting state, functional connectivity, number of ICs, and as it turns out, our team did pretty well. We got about 2nd place, but the team that used only demographics, things like IQ and height and gender, actually got 1st place. So that was disappointing from a feature selection point of view. So we had quite a bit of success with InSight, something like 97% accuracy, but transferring to some of the sites where there was no labeled data was actually a very difficult task. So this requires transfer learning. So to test out the saliency methods, we just decided to choose 2 different slices in the data, the caudate and the amygdala, based on our work, which shows that both the caudate and the amygdala have altered morphometry across the lifespan. So we were inspired by 2 different papers that are fairly classic now in the machine learning, deep learning neural network world. So In this paper, Ian Goodfellow took a panda image where the model classified this panda image as a panda with 57.7% confidence, and then added a small bit of structured noise to that panda image. In this case, it looks like the structured noise was a nematode. And then you get this altered panda image. So what's kind of interesting, and this altered panda image with a small tiny bit of bounded noise is now a given. So this adding bounded noise to an image is actually one of the classic ways to perturb a data set using adversarial examples. So this is kind of amazing to me because what it says really is that the human visual system must in some way learn the noise more effectively or be less vulnerable to adversarial perturbations than the deep learning neural networks. So one of the questions is why? We were also inspired by this nice paper. This is inspired by work from Alex Binder, where if you look here, using a variety of different techniques, they found that this particular model classified horses really well. But when they looked at the relevance scores, they found that it was classifying horses really well because of this copyright symbol. So it's not what one would guess the model was working on. Generally, humans would probably not focus on the copyright symbol and associate that with horses. So combining those two ideas, we wanted to look at how adversarial and didactic examples affected our classification of ADHD versus typically developing brains using just slices from structural MRI. So what we did is we chose to use Ricean noise because Ricean noise is the most classic noise that you might find not only within a specific scanning, or sorry, not only between scanning sites, but also within a specific scanning site over time. So we added different tiny amounts of bounded Ricean noise as an adversarial perturbation. And we also did this funny thing based on the panda. We thought it would be interesting to perturb the images in a way that was didactic and see what happened. So what we did was every time the subject was ADHD, they got a panda in the top right, and every time they were typically developing, they got a small little panda in the top left. And what we found, which is somewhat unsurprising, is that this didactic perturbation, of course, led to 100% accuracy of the model. But we were curious more about how the model interpreted the importance of the features. So we found that an 8-layer BGG convolutional, sorry, an 8-layer CNN worked best. So for the rest of the results, it was just using an 8-layer CNN. So what we found using a whole variety of different interpretation techniques, gradient, smooth grad, guided backprop, pattern net, Lime, what we found was that when you add different amounts of Ricean noise, it alters the explanation in pretty much all of the different techniques that we tried. So what that might mean is that scanning the same subject on a different day on the same scanner or between sites may or may not alter the accuracy or the classification prediction, but it probably, as it would appear, would alter the interpretation. So this was another result that was kind of interesting, is the didactic perturbation were missing from the explanations. So typically, these models chose either the left or the right side panda. They didn't need both. So just like the linear model problems, when there are two voxels side by side that have nearly similar or identical measurements, one of them is de-weighted. Well, the same thing happens as it would appear here in the deep learning case. So just in conclusions, the relevance maps generated using LRP methods were more stable across, thank you, across noise perturbations. Thank you for the charger.
Anybody can tell me? Oh, it's coming. Sorry.
So, unfortunately, none of the methods were complete. So, if you were using deep learning to identify a brain tumor, it might decide that a number of the pixels or voxels inside the brain tumor provide nearly the same or redundant information, and so it doesn't need the entire volume inside the brain tumor. Or it might only select a small part of the brain tumor. And so if your goal is to have a full, complete description or a very sensitive model, then I don't think we're quite there yet. So just some summary and conclusions. Great care should definitely be taken when interpreting, encoding, and decoding results, even in the linear case. It's always a good idea to test multiple models. There's this no free lunch theorem, because testing only a single model may be confirmatory in nature, just like The Simpsons predicting everything. Transparency methods for deep learning is definitely an active and somewhat nascent field of study, and it's definitely an area in need of future research. We are in need of more complex benchmark data sets for explainable AI, where there's a ground truth known for the different relevance maps. And I think that the benchmark perturbations, such as adversarial and didactic perturbations, may help start to identify certain points of model failure. And future work should focus on methods to translate deep learning model explanations into clinically useful metrics, such as sensitivity and specificity. So, thank you so much to all of my collaborators. And not pictured is one of my students, Farzad Vashagani, who I wish I could clone, but is a wonderful grad student. So thank you all so much. That's a great question. Do you mind elaborating a little bit on what you mean by, so do you mean applying the saliency or relevance methods to try and understand the aging brain, or? Yeah, that's a great question. When you have time series data like that, one of the nice techniques to use is, for example, LSTMs, long short-term memory models. And if you look into Deep Light is a really nice interpretability technique developed by Klaus Robert Mueller and colleagues, and they use Deep Light, and they operate using Deep Light on functional MRI time series data, and in combination with layer-wise relevance propagation, I believe it is, and they're able to make really nice predictions as well as interpretations. But I don't know, and they were looking, their ground truth, I believe, in that paper was the general linear model univariate map. So if that is the ground truth in the end, then I think one needs to ask, why are we going through this whole exercise of using deep learning and all of these different algorithms, and then more algorithms to interpret it, and then we end up back with the GLM. But of course, the benefit of these models is the multivariate approach. and also the ability to, in theory, find and lift out the relevant features as the representations are passed through the different layers in the deep learning neural network. So I think more work definitely needs to be done in the world of interpretable and explainable AI. I think it's very important.
Hi. Would you mind elaborating a little more on why you think testing multiple models solves the single model fallacy problem? I mean, wouldn't you just have a dual model fallacy problem?
Absolutely, yes. That's a great question. Absolutely, you can end up having multiple models that are equivalent, and so really you can't distinguish them. It really just depends on how you frame the question. So if you test just one, then you only know how well that does. If you test two and they're equal, then I would say test a few more. I think eventually you'll find perhaps a family or a group of models that outperform others. And if you end up with 2 or 3, then perhaps that can help guide future experimentation, because you can use the findings there to help shape future hypotheses and then try and identify experiments that can tease apart and separate out those competing hypotheses. So it's very difficult sometimes, this problem of identifiability. My background in engineering makes me think of a lot of this work and kind of the state space models and classic systems ID theory. And sometimes sometimes 2 models are indistinguishable. So yeah, that's a great question.
A lot of different and very interesting stuff, but my imagination was sort of captured by these questions. So I was wondering regarding the specific point of the feature fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it sort of problematic from a branding perspective. What do I mean? In the end, the point is that if you have a specific set of features and you can model certain data, doesn't necessarily validate the features. And that is an interesting and important point. Nonetheless, on the other hand, you have the representational similarity fallacy, where you do have an actual set of features that are true. Nonetheless, you can model the data with the wrong features. Therefore, speaking only of feature fallacy, not immediately relating it to the counterpart, which is the representational similarity fallacy, is fallacious in nature. So that's something you have to watch out, because you're biased, like only talking about this fallacy, which is a valid form of fallacy, when you have a much more worrisome form of fallacy, which is the fact that different feature sets can generate the same covariance matrix and only one is true. So that has to be there present too. I just wanted to sort of think, if you agree with that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree with that. That's a great point. Yeah, I'm actually not sure how to expand upon that, but I totally agree with your point. Yeah. But so were you saying, I guess, that you don't like the term feature fallacy because it's too broad, or?
I like it. It's good. You can fall into the fallacy of modeling data with a specific set of features, modeling successfully, inferring that the features are true, and they're not. Feature fallacy, fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also do the opposite, which is relying on similarity, modeling a covariance matrix with inconsistent features, but only one is true and the other one is not. That's also a form of fallacy, because what matters is not only the similarity, the representation similarity. That's another form of fallacy, because something, a specific set of features is true. And that happens in biology actually quite frequently. Therefore, you cannot just throw away the features because you can make fallacies when impairing them. You see? Yes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think maybe we can talk more about this over a coffee later, because I think this is certainly interesting. Yeah.
So the really interesting talk. The points you were discussing at the end about how 1 or 2 features really could drive the classification accuracy is both elegant and in a lot of ways fits neuroscience ideas the human brain quite well, where we see a face, but it's really maybe the eyes or the nose, just a very small subset that lets us distinguish faces. So in that way, it's very elegant. But on the way we're trying to use a lot of these algorithms, to predict diagnoses or these other more complex goals that could also potentially point out why they aren't as transferable or robust as possible. And I wonder if there's a way either at the algorithmic level, as opposed to just sort of perturbing the data sets, to sort of make sure that it's not going to, you know, be sensitive to just one or two features in the image, and it has to sort of bring in more of that information, so it's not going to bias by, you know, just part of a tumor, let's say, as opposed to the whole tumor.
Yeah, that's wow, there's a lot in that question there. Yeah, you're right. Sometimes it is just a small subset or a small region of the image that is really driving the prediction. And you're right, at the algorithmic level, how do we answer that question? How do we really get to really figure out the most sensitive and specific explanations using the model? So of course, if you were to just knock out every single thing that's possibly informative whatsoever, in theory, the model should go to chance. But you might also be eliminating things that were used in the noise cancellation that actually are not informative. So if you're scooping out a brain, you might take out extra area, if that makes sense. So figuring out exactly how to disentangle both the positive and the negative evidence is really important. So one of the things that's interesting with a lot of these methods is that you can tweak the hyperparameters to expand or contract the positive and negative evidence, so you can see more or less depending on the goals of what you're doing. You can also use different reference images. So that actually turns out to be important, and it can create a whole variety of different explanations depending upon what your reference is, what you're comparing to. So are you comparing to just a black or negative image? Are you comparing to a different brain? And yeah, so even if you knock out all of the brain voxels, you might get variation amongst subjects. So it's hard unless you map, I guess, to some sort of an atlas that eases part of the problem with brains, but it's a lot harder when you have boats and cars, because maybe part of the image is operating on the water, and that is actually informative for the boat as opposed to the car. So context, there's a lot of study on how the context can actually affect the classification as well, and how that plays a role in the interpretations as well. So.